It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Margaret Ashford's world shifted with a single text message. She was 67, sitting by the window in her Kensington penthouse, sipping her usual green juice, wearing the same pearl necklace her grandmother had passed down decades ago. She wore it at James's graduation, at his wedding, at every milestone that mattered. That morning she was wearing it simply out of habit. Routine is comforting at that age, especially when your mornings are all your own. But that day, the necklace didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a relic from a world that no longer existed. Her phone buzzed. A message from James. "We're cutting ties. Don't come to family dinner anymore." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. Just a sentence that changed everything. Margaret stared at it for a moment, confused. Surely he didn't mean that dinner. Not all dinners. Surely there was some misunderstanding. But then she opened the family group chat. Everyone had seen it. No one replied. Not a single person asked what was going on. Her daughter-in-law, Sophie, responded with a laughing emoji. Her nephew left the message unread. Her sister-in-law said nothing at all. It was like being erased digitally, emotionally cleanly. With one tap, they had decided she no longer belonged. 30 years of family meals, birthdays, and Christmas mornings wiped away like a chalkboard. Margaret didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt. It did more than she could express. But because she had already shed most of those tears in private. Over the years, she had watched things change little by little, her role in the family shrinking, her opinion less sought after, her presence slowly becoming optional. James had become CEO of Ashford Textiles 5 years ago. Sophie quickly stepped into the role of social matriarch, deciding who was invited, who was excluded. Margaret had sensed it. The awkward glances, the way conversations quieted when she entered a room. But this message was the confirmation. The final nail. She took a deep breath. Then she took a screenshot. It wasn't just about family dinners anymore. Margaret Ashford wasn't just a mother or grandmother. She was the founder of a $250 million textile company. She'd started it with her own 2 hands back when she was a newly widowed mum in her 20s, selling fabric from a corner shop in East London. Over 4 decades, she had built it into a name that meant something. And now her own son, the boy she once carried on her hip while negotiating supplier contracts, had decided she was disposable. But Margaret knew something James didn't. She had been preparing for this moment, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. She'd started noticing little things 3 years ago. A vendor invoice that didn't add up. A charitable donation that never showed up on the charity's ledger. Luxury expenses billed to departments that didn't exist. Small things. But small things build into patterns. And patterns lead to truth. She never made a scene, never asked direct questions. She just started collecting. She hired a private financial investigator under a strict confidentiality agreement. Month by month, evidence piled up, emails, transfers, receipts. She watched, waited, and documented. And now, with one arrogant message, James had unknowingly pulled the trigger. Margaret stood and walked to the kitchen, calm and deliberate. She opened the top drawer next to the stove. No one else ever touched that drawer. Inside was a thick manila folder, worn at the edges, stuffed with printouts, notes, and screenshots. It held 3 years' worth of quiet watching, proof not just of mismanagement, but of betrayal, of theft, of moral rot at the center of something she built with care. She didn't feel rage, not even shock anymore, just a kind of steely resolve that came from knowing exactly what needed to happen next. She walked back to the living room and picked up the landline, a phone only one other person had the number to. It rang twice before a voice answered, smooth and sharp. Eleanor Barrington. Margaret didn't hesitate. It's Margaret. I think it's time. A pause, then a soft chuckle on the other end. I've been waiting for this call. Margaret pulled back the curtain, letting the London light pour in. She stared out over the skyline, the city where she had made a name for herself, brick by brick, thread by thread. Well, she said, the voice steady. Wait no more. How soon can you get here? For you, Eleanor replied. 1 hour. Margaret hung up, turned to the mirror above the fireplace, and looked herself in the eye. She didn't see a discarded mother or a sideline grandmother. She saw a founder, a fighter, a woman who'd built something from nothing. James wanted to cut her off. Perfect. She was about to hand him the sharpest scissors he'd ever seen. Eleanor Barrington arrived exactly on time, as Margaret knew she would. The doorman announced her name with a tone that suggested he knew whoever this woman was, she wasn't someone you kept waiting. Eleanor stepped into the penthouse like she owned the place, tall, sharp, wearing tailored trousers and heels that clicked against the marble like the opening notes of a warning. She didn't do small talk. She air-kissed Margaret on both cheeks, then stepped back and gave her a once-over approving but not fawning. You look radiant, she said. Revenge suits you. Margaret gave a small smile. I haven't even started. They walked into the living room where the coffee table had already been cleared and converted into what could only be described as a war room. There were stacks of papers, old invoices, highlighted spreadsheets, folders color-coded and labeled by category: vendor fraud, charitable misdirection, executive abuse of funds. It looked obsessive, but it wasn't. It was exact. Margaret poured 2 glasses of champagne, one of the better bottles, and handed one to Eleanor. To what are we drinking? Eleanor asked, raising her glass. Margaret clinked hers gently. To James's education. He's about to learn what happens when you forget who built the playground you're playing in. That got a raised eyebrow from Eleanor and a flash of a grin. She set her glass down and rolled up her sleeves. Show me what you got. Margaret didn't hesitate. She opened the thick manila folder and began laying everything out. It wasn't just shady spending. It was deliberate fraud hidden behind fake vendor names and buried in vague line items like strategic development or staff morale initiatives. There were hotel receipts tied to a non-existent outreach program, designer handbags marked as administrative supplies, one $20,000 watch listed under executive wellness. There were also offshore transfers, quiet, repeated, and just under the reporting threshold every time, all signed off by either James or Sophie. There were screenshots of internal emails, annotated financial statements, and a couple of very damning photos. Sophie carrying bags out of a boutique, walking straight to a chauffeured car funded by Ashford Textiles charity branch. Eleanor flipped through it, all her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but edged with steel. This isn't just unethical, this is criminal. Embezzlement, fraud, possibly tax evasion. Margaret nodded. I let love delay justice for too long. But love doesn't excuse theft, not from my company, not from my employees, and not from the foundation that was meant to help children's cancer patients. Eleanor leaned back, tapping one perfectly manicured finger on the arm of her chair. So what's your move? Margaret didn't miss a beat. I sell you my shares, 49.8% with full voting proxy and a clause that allows you to audit every corner of the company, and I want it done before James can react. Eleanor didn't even blink. And after that, we clean house, Margaret said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. We show them what accountability looks like, and we remind everyone watching that dismissing me was the worst mistake James ever made. There was a beat of silence. Then Eleanor gave a slow nod. This is going to be fun. Margaret exhaled the first real breath she'd taken all day. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was focused. James thought he could cut her out like a budget line. Sophie thought she could laugh her way to power. What neither of them understood was that Margaret had spent decades building not just a company, but a reputation. And now she was about to use both to burn the rot straight out of it. And they wouldn't even see it coming. The paperwork was signed within 24 hours. Margaret handed over her 49.8% shares to Eleanor Barrington with ironclad clauses, attached clauses that gave her full voting rights, unrestricted audit authority, and the legal muscle to remove any executive implicated in misconduct. It wasn't just a transfer of shares, it was a transfer of power. And with that single act, Margaret set everything in motion. By the next morning, Eleanor's team of forensic accountants was already combing through 5 years of financial records. The formal letter to the board requesting immediate transparency had gone out before James had finished his morning espresso. Eleanor didn't waste time with courtesies or warnings. She came in like a cold front, clean-cutting and impossible to ignore. Margaret sat in her penthouse, watching the ripples begin to form. She didn't answer James's calls. Not the one at 10:12 a.m., not the one at 10:14. She read the texts as they came in one after another. What did you mean by last family dinner? Mom, answer your phone. This isn't funny anymore. Sophie is having a panic attack. Are you happy now? Margaret didn't reply. She took screenshots of each one instead and saved them in a new folder on her desktop. She labeled it Evidence Emotional Reactions, not because she planned to use them, but because she wanted to remember how quickly fear replaced arrogance when the consequences finally showed up. By early afternoon, Eleanor was back at the penthouse laptop, open papers spread out, speaking in her brisk, clear tone as she updated Margaret. He tried to block the audit, she said, called an emergency vote with the board to delay it. Margaret raised an eyebrow. And he seems to have forgotten who holds the voting rights now, Eleanor said with a dry smile. Margaret allowed herself a small laugh. He's not used to consequences. He thinks silence means surrender. Well, Eleanor said, glancing at her screen. Sophie's already trying to distance herself. She just sent an email to the Charitable Foundation's board, claiming she had no idea any of the purchases were inappropriate. Let me guess, Margaret said. She called the 40,000 handbag an essential administrative tool. Close Eleanor replied, said it was required for donor relations. They both laughed, but not out of amusement. It was that kind of bitter laugh you share when something is so ridiculous it almost deserves applause. As the day went on, the audit team uncovered 2 forged vendor contracts and over 2.5 million questionable transactions. The money trail was ugly obvious once you knew where to look, but cleverly hidden from anyone not paying attention. Margaret had to admit they'd been slick. Not smart, but slick. Still, she wasn't celebrating. Not yet. This wasn't about personal satisfaction. It was about principle. About protecting the company she'd built from being hollowed out by entitlement. She thought back to the early days, long nights balancing the books by hand, negotiating with stubborn suppliers, fighting to get banks to take her seriously as a young widow trying to build something real. Ashford Textiles wasn't just a business. It was her life's work. It had helped thousands of employees build careers, supported charities, and meant something in an industry known for cutting corners. She wasn't about to watch it be dragged into scandal by her own son. So she stayed quiet, patient, and steady. While James panicked and Sophie scrambled, Margaret simply watched the truth surface, slowly, painfully, and undeniably. The groundwork was done. The evidence was there. Now all that was left was the reckoning, and it was coming. Tomorrow they'd walk into that boardroom thinking they still had control. By the time they left, they'd understand exactly how wrong they were. The boardroom was colder than usual, though the temperature hadn't changed. It was the kind of chill that had nothing to do with air conditioning and everything to do with tension. Margaret arrived 5 minutes early, dressed in a navy blue Chanel suit and wearing the same pearl necklace James had once complimented at his college graduation. Today, it felt less like jewelry and more like armor. She took her seat calmly at the long mahogany table, eyes steady, hands folded neatly in her lap. Eleanor Barrington was already at the far-end laptop, open-flanked by 2 forensic accountants and her legal team. She looked perfectly composed, as if she were attending a lunch briefing rather than the corporate equivalent of a firing squad. One by one, the board members filed in, some curious, some cautious, a few already sensing the winds had shifted. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the double doors burst open. James walked in, tight, slightly crooked eyes, wild face pale. Sophie followed close behind, clutching her designer purse like it was the last thing anchoring her to the room they didn't sit. James went straight into performance mode. "This audit is a personal attack," he declared too loudly. "It's harassment and completely out of line." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Mr. Ashford," she said coolly, "I now own 51% of this company by proxy. That makes me the majority shareholder. This audit is not an attack. It's standard protocol under shareholder rights." James blinked. "That's impossible. My mother only had 49.8%. She transferred her shares to me yesterday," Margaret interrupted, her voice level. "Along with full voting rights and audit authority. The board was notified this morning." James looked around the table, eyes darting from face to face, waiting for anyone to speak up. No one did. One board member looked down at his notes. Another sipped coffee. It was as if they'd all been waiting for this moment. Eleanor began distributing documents. "These are vendor invoices, expense reports, and banking transactions going back 3 years," she explained. "All linked either directly or indirectly to James or Sophie Ashford." Sophie fumbled with the paper as it slipped from her hand and landed face up on the table. It showed a $20,000 charge to the Ashford Children's Foundation for a luxury watch purchase. The room was dead silent, except for the quiet hum of the overhead lights. James tried to recover. That was a gift for a client, a long-time donor. Charged to a charity account, Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That's creative." Margaret stood then, slowly, not raising her voice, but commanding attention all the same. She looked directly at James. "Do you remember when you were 7 and you stole biscuits from Mrs. Hutchinson's pantry and blamed the housekeeper?" she asked quietly. James flinched. "You let an innocent woman take the blame because it was easy, because it meant you didn't have to face the consequences. And I made you walk back, apologize, and pay for every last biscuit from your allowance. That was the first time I taught you about accountability." She walked closer, every step deliberate. Apparently you forgot. Eleanor stood and read from her legal pad. By vote of the majority shareholder, James Ashford, you are hereby terminated from all positions within Ashford Textiles, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. James opened his mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. Sophie whispered something to him. He shook his head. She looked away. Margaret turned to the rest of the board. This company was built on integrity. Somewhere along the way, we lost our way. But as of today, we're back on track. As James and Sophie were escorted from the room, Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or toss out a parting jab. She just returned to her seat, folded her hands again, and waited calmly for the next agenda item. Because for her, this wasn't revenge, it was a restoration. 3 days after the boardroom showdown, Margaret sat in a quiet corner of a private restaurant in Mayfair, sipping tea from a bone china cup and waiting. The table was set for 4. She'd chosen this place deliberately, discreet, comfortable, familiar. She wanted her guests to feel safe, not summoned. One by one, they arrived. Fiona Harding, the former head of HR, Clara Middleton, who once led finance, and Rachel Whitmore, who had run community outreach before she was pushed out. They hadn't seen each other in years, but the moment they all sat down, it felt like old times, except this time, no one was pretending everything was fine. I thought you'd moved to the coast, Fiona said after a pause, stirring her tea. James told everyone you'd retired, said you were slowing down. Margaret gave a quiet smile. Apparently I also had early dementia and wasn't fit to make decisions anymore. The women exchanged stunned looks. Clara leaned forward. He said that to justify restructuring us out. We weren't pushed, Margaret. We were erased. Rachel nodded, eyes already glassy. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fight it. Margaret let the silence sit for a moment before reaching into her handbag. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook, pages already well worn, and slid it across the table. You were right. You were pushed out for asking questions, for keeping your standards. And I didn't stop it soon enough. But that ends now. I need your help. I'm not just cleaning up numbers. I'm rebuilding the soul of this company. They opened the notebook together, flipping through pages and of handwritten notes, ideas for new leadership practices, employee oversight panels, fair bonus systems, whistleblower protection, and a completely restructured charity division with full transparency. It wasn't a flashy comeback plan. It was a blueprint for integrity. I want you back, Margaret said plainly. No politics, no games, just the work we were meant to do. Fiona looked down at the page in front of her, then back at Margaret. Why now? Margaret didn't flinch. Because I let love blind me. I was so busy protecting my son, I forgot to protect what we built. That won't happen again. Clara reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. You didn't fail us, Margaret. You were being lied to like the rest of us. Rachel wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. And now you're leading again. That's what matters. Margaret took a breath, a full, clean breath, the kind that fills you in a way that nothing rushed or reactive ever could. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the weight of pretending everything was fine. She wasn't defending someone who didn't deserve it. She was simply doing what she did best, building. That afternoon, after the meeting ended and hugs were exchanged, Margaret returned home and typed a message to Eleanor, the team is coming home. She stared at those words for a moment before hitting send. There was no grand speech, No corporate memo, just the quiet return of people who had always been the true heart of the company, the ones who cared, the ones who told the truth, and now they would be the ones to help rebuild it. Ashford Textiles wasn't just recovering, it was becoming something better than it had ever been. They made one last attempt to stop her. A quiet lawsuit filed by Sophie's family solicitor landed on Margaret's desk like a badly timed joke. The claim that Margaret had been emotionally manipulated into transferring her shares, that she wasn't of sound mind, that Eleanor had coerced her in a moment of vulnerability. Margaret read the filing with a raised eyebrow and a slow sip of tea. Then she laughed, not because it didn't sting, but because it was so transparently desperate, so insulting it almost worked in her favor. They're saying I was too emotionally fragile to make legal decisions, she told Eleanor over breakfast the next morning, but somehow strong enough to orchestrate a hostile takeover. Eleanor didn't even look up from her coffee. Contradictions make great headlines. The media's going to love this. And they did. 2 days later, Margaret stood behind a podium in a sharp navy pantsuit, her pearl necklace glinting under the lights, the London skyline glowing behind her through the glass. Journalists filled the press room. Cameras flashed. The buzz was electric. She didn't waste time. She held up a thick folder, steady and unapologetic. I've been accused of being mentally unfit, she began, voice calm but clear. These are the records I personally compiled over the last 3 years, evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and betrayal. The room went silent. I may be 67. I may enjoy early morning walks and crossword puzzles, but I am not confused. I am not weak. And I am certainly not someone who disappears quietly. There was a beat of silence, and then laughter, supportive, genuine, like a collective breath being let out. A reporter from the Times raised her hand. Mrs. Ashford, what do you want people to take away from all this? Margaret looked directly into the nearest camera lens. That family doesn't give you a free pass to steal. That love should never require silence, and that dismissing someone based on age or gender is a mistake you only make once. That line was quoted on every major news outlet by nightfall. The lawsuit was dropped the next morning. Sophie's legal team quietly withdrew, citing irreconcilable inconsistencies. Meanwhile, federal investigators began their own review of the financial records, and within 2 weeks, James and Sophie were formally charged with multiple counts of corporate fraud and misuse of charitable funds. But Margaret didn't celebrate with noise. She didn't post online or issue some self-congratulatory press release. Instead, she went back to the office, walked the floors of the building she hadn't set foot in for years, and shook hands with employees who now looked at her like something between a legend and a lifeline. For the first time in ages, she felt seen, not as James's mother or a founder emeritus, but as a leader. Her name, once whispered with confusion or pity, now carried weight again. Not because she'd shouted louder, but because she'd stood firm. The headlines weren't about the scandal anymore. They were about the woman who refused to stay silent. 6 months later, Ashford Textiles didn't just survive the scandal, it thrived beyond what anyone had expected. The company's valuation rose sharply under its new ethical leadership, crossing the 300 million mark for the first time in years. 3 of the firm's biggest clients, who had quietly walked away during James's tenure, returned without fanfare, signing new long-term contracts. Employee satisfaction reached its highest levels in over a decade, and in every board meeting, Margaret sat at the head of the table, not as a relic of the past, but as a woman fully in command of the future. Across from her sat Fiona, Clara, and Rachel. No longer former employees or symbols of what went wrong, they were now department heads again, trusted, respected, empowered, and this time they weren't alone. A new generation of staff was rising beneath them, many of whom had never known Ashford Textiles before the changes. They weren't just working for a paycheck. They believed in the mission now. The company launched a scholarship fund through its newly restructured foundation, supporting young women studying business finance and ethical entrepreneurship. Margaret named it the Wilson Foundation, not after herself, but after her grandmother, the woman who gave her the pearl necklace and first taught her how to stand her ground with grace. Ironically, many of the luxury handbags Sophie had purchased with stolen funds were auctioned off to pay for the scholarships, 50 full scholarships to be exact. When Eleanor told her that number, Margaret just smiled. They built their empire on other people's money, she said. We're building futures with it. When Forbes UK published its cover story, The Woman Who Reclaimed Her Name, the interview was sharp-focused and honest. When asked if she had any regrets, Margaret didn't hesitate. Just one, she said, that I didn't act sooner. Every day I waited, someone else paid the price. But at home, her peace was quieter. Her weekends belonged to her grandson, Oliver. Every Saturday at 10 a.m. sharp, he arrived at her flat with croissants, coffee, and a backpack full of papers. He always took the same seat, end of the leather sofa legs, curled underneath him, eyes bright. "Grandma," he said one morning, flipping open his folder, 3 more family-run businesses reached out to Oxford. They want guidance, governance, protocols, ethical systems, internal checks. You're officially a case study. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me corporate ethics is trending?" He grinned. "No, I'm telling you you're trending." She laughed, setting aside the stack of scholarship applications she'd been reviewing. It was strange in a way to be seen not as the woman who'd lost control of her company or the mother who'd been pushed aside, but as the one who'd shown how to take it all back with integrity still intact. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sent a short message. "They've greenlit the documentary. The title is Margaret Ashford, the Woman Who Wouldn't Disappear." Margaret read it twice, then smiled. James had tried to erase her. Instead, he'd made her unforgettable. As she looked out across the city, she didn't feel bitter. She didn't even miss James, not really. What she missed was the version of him she thought was real, the son she believed she was raising, the family she'd imagined they could be. But the truth was not every relationship deserves reconciliation. Some endings are necessary for new beginnings, and the woman she had become, the leader, the mentor, the force only existed because she'd finally chosen herself. That evening, she opened her laptop one last time. She clicked into a folder labeled Legacy and added a few notes, small things, ideas for the foundation, maybe a letter to Oliver for the future. Then she closed it, not out of fear or exhaustion, but because the story felt finished. To anyone watching, listening, or living through something similar, she hoped they understood this much. You are not weak for being betrayed. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. And you are not alone for choosing peace over proximity. The truth was simple. Sometimes the best revenge is becoming impossible to ignore.